Hi, everyone. I'm Kathleen O'Connell, National Education Director for the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times and Education webcast on political leadership. We would love to have you join the conversation. Simply type your questions into the space provided, and I will relay those to our speaker. We're pleased to have Jim Rutenberg with us today. Jim is the Chief Political Correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. Thanks for being here, Jim.
Thanks so much for having me.
To start things off, Jim, what does political leadership mean to you?
Well,
And does it exist?
well, when you guys came to me with this speaking topic, I was a little bit stumped. I mean, it's a very broad topic, political leadership. What does that even mean, right? I mean, it can mean a lot. But you start when you prepare for one of these. Let me think of some examples, and I realized that I was having a really hard time coming up with examples because there, frankly, aren't a lot of them these days. So I was going to kind of tweak the title of our discussion, which it was initially Political Leadership, and I guess I'm going to call it Political Leadership Find Waldo Edition. I've been covering local and national politics for more than 20 years now, and that provides a lot of ground to cover. But what I'd like to do is start with our most recent political landscape and work back some, showing where political leadership is broken down and where it has somehow managed to peek through in spite of a climate that I've come to think is simply not necessarily conducive to very much leadership. And the very definition of leadership is changing before our eyes in potentially historical ways, and maybe this will change quickly in the coming 2 years, but this is where we are now. And let's start with where our body politic lies. Here on March 15th, 2014, President Obama is at a very low approval rating. Now, it's important to keep this in perspective, and today I checked his rating historically compared to other presidents. Gallup has President Obama at 44, which is absolutely abysmal, not where a president wants to be, especially midway through a second term facing midterm elections. But at a similar point during his presidency, George W. Bush had an approval rating of 37.5%, really low. As we may recall, and I personally recall because I covered those midterms as a White House correspondent, that is when Bush was delivered a quote-unquote thumping, which he had a lot of fun with kind of calling it that. I think it helped him sort of lighten the mood of what was just an absolute walloping. But Obama could be heading into the similar fate this year. And now, Bush's approval rating was really low for a lot of obvious reasons. Iraq was going horribly, and this was after the famous Mission Accomplished banner on, I think it was the USS Lincoln. So there was sectarian violence spinning out of control, talk of civil war. That was dominating everything. On top of that, history will always remember it was a war waged on faulty intelligence. His chief mission of capturing Osama bin Laden remained undone. His domestic policy goal of creating private accounts for Social Security had failed, had just gone nowhere. And his big ticket item that he was going to take on for the rest of his second term, a liberalization of the nation's immigration rules, angered many of his own party, a large percentage of whom were also very upset about spending. It's kind of like the seeds of the Tea Party movement. So we would expect him to be, again, 37.5, just terrible. But what gives in Obama's case? And I found myself sometimes wondering at myself because things have certainly not gone swimmingly, but he is getting hammered out there without like a single, until, let's face it, until a couple months ago, and I'll get to that, without a single defining event that would have caused this collapse. But it's sort of been a drip, drip, drip. So shortly after his second inauguration, he was hovering at an approval rating of 50%. This is vital for a successful presidency and certainly for successful midterms to be at 50%. That's where the president wants to be at or close to 50% at the very least. But his drop followed a succession of political failures, all of which are arguably, or could be arguably, failures of leadership. His vow to change the nation's gun laws following the horrible massacre in Connecticut ultimately went nowhere. which just made people wonder what's happening. He just won a big election. Why can't he get this done? Ditto, his proposal to overhaul the immigration system upset many people in his own base, especially Latino voters who hoped he would get more done here. He drew a so-called red line on Syria, warning of grave repercussions if it was found to have used chemical weapons, then offered no red line of real substance or consequences of real substance after that red line was apparently almost definitively crossed. In part, of course, that was because Republican libertarians on Capitol Hill made it clear they would block any military move, at least try to kind of stop it legislatively. His ultimate success, an agreement from Syria to destroy its chemical weapons, actually came in a deal brokered by Vladimir Putin, leading to catcalls from Republicans that he was outmaneuvered by his Russian rival and taking away what he could point to as a success, and it still does. Then finally, of course, there was this awful botched rollout of healthcare.gov, his signature legislative accomplishment, which showed his administration lost track of the most important item of his entire presidency. I think his people would have to agree with that. Now, it's expected that Republicans would disapprove of a Democratic president, but through all of this, Mr. Obama has lost some support of many of his own. Many liberals were disappointed that he hadn't stayed true to the liberal themes that they had expected from his presidency. Now he's trying to kind of recover some of that through executive order, controversial way to proceed. So as a paid observer of our national politics, this has all been somewhat surprising to me, as I said, because in 2008, President Obama showed incredible leadership in building a national movement from scratch. As a little-known state legislator from Illinois, he overcame the juggernaut that was and may soon again be Hillary Clinton. And he arguably did it in showing leadership where Hillary Clinton did not. His early stance against the war, which came in 2002 when he was an Illinois state legislator, came at a time when Democrats nationally were going along with the Iraq invasion. And part of this was amid fear that they'd be tagged as unpatriotic or insufficient to the task of combating terrorism after 9/11. And really, I think leadership is never born of that kind of timidity of looking over your shoulder, worried about what the consequences will be for any decision. Obviously, that has to be in the mix, but it's obviously not a recipe for leadership. What Obama found in part was that perhaps his almost divinely given oratorical skills raised expectations beyond what was doable. And I was covering the Bush administration at that time, and I knew a lot of things. And you see this in every presidential campaign. Candidates can make these great pie-in-the-sky promises without taking into account the reality of being in a White House and having an opposition on Capitol Hill. The added goodwill he had as the nation's first African-American president quickly dissipated with the rise of the Tea Party that was opposed to what Obama had vowed would be a transformational presidency. And think about what he was promising with that transformation: an overhaul of United States energy policy that played to kind of fears of global warming, an overhaul of immigration laws after President Bush couldn't even get immigration through his own party, immigration overhaul, changes in gun policy, national security policy, and yes, again, health care. But what he also arguably found was that where leadership was once defined as forging compromise, which is how I was raised, and I'm sure you all were raised growing up in school, in high school and grammar school, is no longer really the way it's defined. It used to be bringing disagreeing parties together to do big things was kind of the definition of leadership. And these days, it's often within each party to find a sticking to principles no matter what the end result is. So the compromise that once defined great leadership can now just as often be identified as weakness. So it is now commonly said that, and actually let me preface this, I'm going to use the healthcare law as a sort of case in point. It is now commonly said that President Obama only passed his healthcare law with Democratic support, thus sowing the seeds of its constant state of political siege. And there's definitely something to that. But it is arguably the case that there was no way he was ever going to get a healthcare law through with bipartisan support. His advisors will tell you that he started out on a compromised footing. During his campaign, and it's easy to forget this, I think I had to go look this up again. During the campaign, he had proposed a federal health care plan that would compete with private sector plans on exchanges like the ones coming online now. So there would be a government-run healthcare option. It would have been one of many options that were private, but it was a publicly constructed healthcare plan. He dropped that amid conservative cries that he was seeking to nationalize healthcare, and against his stance during the campaign, he embraced a plan that had actually been hatched by a conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, that would have required all Americans to buy health insurance or face fines. This so-called mandate that was once embraced by Newt Gingrich and certainly was embraced by Mitt Romney in Massachusetts. So it would seem like a slam dunk for compromise on its face. First, President Obama faced a lot of anger from liberals who believed he was abandoning them by abandoning the federal plan. Many of them wanted a single payer plan, one nationalized system. And this robbed him of an army of passionate supporters that he would have otherwise had. So he's getting kind of beaten up on his own side for compromise. At least liberals would call this compromise. Conservatives didn't, but and don't consider that compromise. But anyway, and he found zero takers on the Republican side. In part, this was due to a shift in the Republican Party, which had moved away from the idea of a health insurance mandate as it became a more as the libertarian streak of the party kind of rose, and the kind of there was an anti-government interventionist streak that took hold in the post-Bush era. Most of all, the conservative grassroots were totally opposed to any compromise that would bring any kind of national health care overhaul. The mandate was seen far from being conservative as being, overreaching government to the max. And it quickly became clear as well that Republican leaders in Congress were going to be judged both by their activists kind of base and their conservative donors on how far they would go to stop Obama and resist compromise. In my mind, one of the biggest revelations on that score came when a colleague and I reported on the Republican approach after the 2010 midterms, when Obama really got killed in those elections. The party lost the House, I'm pretty sure I'd have to look at the numbers right now, but were weakened in the Senate. When we went back to kind of track how the Republicans pulled that off, so more than a week before Obama's inauguration, Republican leadership in the House met with their rank and file, and they presented two kind of critical PowerPoint slides. The first read, "If the goal of the majority is to govern, what is the purpose of the minority?" A second slide answered, "The purpose of the minority is to become the majority." So with that in mind, again, it was just inconceivable Obama was going to get any compromise on anything he could claim as a major success. And I would say that stands today as his success equals success for his potential Democratic successors in 2016. I want to note that I don't think Democrats would have done anything differently from their Republican counterparts in this climate. I could just as easily see their minority taking a similar stance. And really during the Bush, after the 2006 losses for Bush, the Democrats set about to halt anything Bush was going to do as well. I guess with the exception of immigration, where they had their own issues. Now, one can say that a great leader will find a way to overcome that sort of resistance. And arguably one of the greatest Democratic politicians of the last 50 years was Bill Clinton, who did manage to overcome really stiff opposition on the Hill. He had an advantage that Obama did not, I think. He had an opposition that didn't have couldn't learn the lesson of its own kind of future. Newt Gingrich and his Congress provided lessons for future Republican majorities. He so overreached in trying to impeach Clinton, in trying to eradicate entire departments upon the '94 revolution that swept him into power, and finally in shutting down the government, that he kind of lost the support of the country and handed more support back to Clinton, gave Clinton capital when he was badly in need of it. And Clinton, after the '94 midterms, was really in trouble. None of this is to take away from Clinton's leadership style. his 1993 tax increase did help lead to those 94 Republican victories, but it's credited by many economists, admittedly many of them liberal, but some moderates as well, with putting the national budget not just back into balance, but into surplus. He found common cause with Republicans in terms of overhauling welfare programs that were doing as much to help people as to keep them in a cycle of dependency. So he really got beyond his party. His party kind of supported a system that was becoming unsustainable politically. It just didn't seem, just seemed to be prolonging poverty in some respects. All that said, there's no getting around his personal behavior. Whatever your take on the Monica Lewinsky scandal, it's undeniable that that completely derailed his agenda, gave his opponents an arsenal of weaponry to use against him, and mired the country in scandal. As important issues were really swirling, we lose track of this, but at that time, when the nation was obsessed with Monica Lewinsky, for fair reason, Osama bin Laden was building Al-Qaeda. So I don't know if you can fairly say one has to do with the other, but there's far more important things to focus on nationally than sex scandal. And so, again, some people said, well, it's none of the nation's business, what he did in his personal life. A lot of people ardently disagree with that. Either way, you can't deny that it distracted his administration in a way that undercut anything he wanted to do. And interestingly, he sort of ended his presidency with a better approval rating than one would have expected, actually won some seats in the second midterms, but again, he had some overreach in the opposition side. So as I come to a close here, come near a close here, I admit that I'm offering a pretty cynical view of leadership in our current times. So I'll try to kind of try to temper some of that with some recent instances of leadership. I mean, there have been these flashes of leadership, if not full leadership. Bill Clinton rallied the nation after the bombing at a government building in Oklahoma City. Many of you are probably too young to remember, but it was an instance of domestic terrorism. The nation was stunned, and Clinton kind of saved his presidency. This was post the Republican Revolution, by vowing to bring the bombers to justice, saying the God of comfort is also the God of righteousness, kind of channeling the anger of the country, which helped him again regain his footing. George W. Bush's moment following the September 11th attacks, when he stood on a pile of rubble with cheering rescue workers at Ground Zero and rallied the nation. Many of you may remember this. He grabbed a bullhorn, kind of took one of the firemen by the shoulders, and as they cheered USA, USA, he said, I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon. Undeniably a moment of national unity that really brought the country together after Bush kind of struggled initially to sort of gain his footing, but that was a moment that will definitely live on in history. And Obama had a couple of moments, particularly with his speeches, where he's really seemed to capture the mood of the country. His speeches against a red state America and a blue state America that made him a national figure, and his so-called Reverend Wright speech when he spoke about his own experience in relation to the arc of African Americans from slavery to his candidacy. He called, quote, a story that has seared into my genetic makeup the idea that this nation is more than the sum of its parts, that out of many we are truly one. And he said his own success had shown, quote, how hungry the American people were for his message of, quote unquote, unity. Of course, again, here we are. That unity has not evidenced itself during his presidency. He still has 2 years to find it and feed it, and if he doesn't, it'll fall to his successor. But whether that's possible may depend on what might be today's silent majority, kind of centrists or moderates from both parties who really want to see some compromise, but are at this point drowned out by the activists on each side of each party who really care about principle first. And if maybe one of those sides will be able to sell that vision across party lines, that would make something happen, or compromise will become less of a dirty word. And that's what I got.
Thanks, Jim. So we have a question from Wilkes University. Do you believe we set too high a moral standard for our political leaders? And if so, due to this high moral standard for our political leadership, do you think we get a particular type of leader, political leader, that is able to handle that type of scrutiny?
I love this question because it's a question I'm kind of working through right now a little bit with one of my pieces. Let's just put it this way. Anthony Weiner could have become mayor of New York. He could have. Given his Twitter scandal, he still was up in the polls when he re-entered the political fray. So I think where we used to expect our leaders to hit a certain moral standard, I think the expectations are sliding down in terms of moral expectations, and maybe that's, that the early things we expected in our leaders were unrealistic, or maybe they weren't, and we as a culture have changed our mores. So I'm not saying that someone could be a complete carouser, or just show zero moral fiber can ever become president. But these scandals are increasingly potentially survivable. And so I think that people are expecting a little less on the personal side of their leaders, or at least not setting unrealistic bars. It's not a given. Weiner didn't win, but he didn't exactly comport himself in a way that would have helped him to win. Others have been asked for forgiveness and tried to set new examples. So I think that's shifting in really interesting ways.
Okay. We have a question from the College of Staten Island. What place does race fit into this theory about President Obama's, quote, lack of leadership / success, end quote, during his 8 years in office?
It's a great question, and I should have written that into this. Obama himself said in a recent interview with the New Yorker that he thinks it helps him and hurts him. So what he said was that he gets some support from voters because he's African American, and he didn't just mean among African Americans. I think he meant across racial lines, but that he also probably lost some points because of race from the other side due to some racism. It's something I think that none of us has done a great job sort of pinpointing, because it's really hard to pinpoint where is it a race issue, where how much of the disapproval is due to race, and how much of it's due to other factors. Really hard to say, almost impossible to poll for. And I think part of the problem, but I do think it warrants a lot more discussion, and it has to be in the mix somewhere, given our history, and certain things that you still see in the culture once here or there. So the one problem with that discussion not going forward is that Obama's aides hate talking about race. They always have. When he ran in his first campaign, they really avoided the question, and it was an important, interesting question. And their point was, well, we don't want to talk about it because we will win, or Obama will win, if he's seen as the first president who happens to be black. He will not win if he runs as the first African American to become president. It's subtle, but they live and die by it. So they don't want to discuss it. But every time they do raise it, they get accused by their opponents of looking to play the race card. But no question, it's to some degree or another, and it warrants a better investigation. And I think a lot of us are trying to figure out how that you would kind of quantify it. It's got to be in the mix, but I can't say how significant it is. Healthcare.gov wasn't botched because of anything other than some incompetence in the bureaucracy. So a lot of things have happened, would have happened to any president. Bill Clinton faced, there are conspiracy theories about Obama's legitimacy due to these birther theories. Bill Clinton faced a lot of conspiracy theories too. So it's such a hard question to tackle.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question from Kansas State University. Are the leadership skills, abilities, or qualities needed for an effective or successful campaign different in meaningful ways from the leadership needed for effective governing?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. And I think we've seen great examples both in the Obama presidency and the Bush presidency. It's so much easier, especially as a fresh face, to make these great promises, hire really good people, and run a really good organization. And I do think you have to show you can run a good campaign to become president. It's the only little inkling, especially when you're new on the scene, for the voters to see that you can run something. Anyway, it's way easier than coming into office, seeing the realities. You still have to communicate just as well as you did during the campaign, which is all a campaign is about. All those resources are about communicating. You have ads running in your favor, knocking your opponents. If you're really successful, you have way better resources to get more ads than your opponents. So you have all this wind at your back. To be a great president, you have to still be able to communicate well. You have the White House, which helps you communicate. But then you have to govern, and governing is so messy. Horse trading on the Hill now is so transparent. That's hard to do. Convincing people to come with you in a bifurcated kind of political culture right now with networks bolstering each side's hardcore point of view, it's very hard. They're two different skills. And sometimes I think, and again, this warrants journalistic kind of investigation, is the modern presidential campaign really doing much to inform us about what our president's going to be like in office? And sometimes those campaigns, and we all bear some responsibility in this, get so silly and get fought for weeks on dumb issues that the campaigns talk about, we get sucked into talking about with them, that really have no bearing on how someone's going to run a White House or administration.
Okay, thanks. We have one more question. Who do you see as potential political leaders of the future, and why?
That's a really hard question. I do think there's a strong crop from both sides coming up. Look, right now, Hillary Clinton is seen as the Democratic candidate. Now, I remember people saying that 8 years ago or 6 years ago, you name it, and she lost, right? And she did not run a great campaign against Obama, and I think that's part of the reason she lost was technical things that her campaign failed to do. She's had her issues at the Department of State. Benghazi is going to be brought up. That was a sort of bad moment for her as a leader. But she also has garnered a ton of experience. She's done many of her. She was a senator. She's a Secretary of State, and she's shown plenty of aplomb in those jobs. She's going to be hard to beat, but there are new Democrats coming up. Kristen Gillibrand from here in New York. Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts is really kind of getting a lot of support from real liberals who might find Hillary Clinton too moderate. So the Democrats have a bench. Martin O'Malley of Maryland is seen as potential contender. Again, I think if Hillary doesn't run. And on the Republican side, Jeb Bush lurks. His family name, fellow family members have said, even his mother said could be an issue, but he has some potential cross-party appeal, especially on issues like immigration. Rand Paul is really hitting a chord. He has a long way to go to build a real organization and show that he's got what it takes to make it all the way, but he's in the mix. You have Paul Ryan, who is trying to build something, Marco Rubio. So the Republicans have a really solid bench too, I think.
I'm not hearing Chris Christie.
Chris Christie, he can survive his scandal. So he really can, and if you talk to his people, they say he will because their point is, should he go forward with a run, he'll be running against other people, and every candidate has his or her failings, so they think he can survive. And Chris Christie really has an ability to excite Republicans, and as he showed in his New Jersey re-election campaign, win over Democrats, and not only from the ways that have come out in this scandal. There was a lot of cajoling and horse trading that has come out, but he did inspire some real Democratic support. So there is a good crop of leaders. Again, the question is, whoever wins, can they show real leadership to bring the whole country with them? And I'm not talking about, God forbid, some horrible tragedy befalls the country. Leadership kind of comes more naturally then. But But leadership in a day-to-day basis, like we're in right now, where we have our challenges, but nothing's like not in a crisis situation. Can you bring the country behind you to do big things?
Great. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you.